Playing politics with redistricting, Governor Quinn gets a visitor from outer space, and state canoes are we barely knew ye. We've got that and more next on Capitol View. Hello and welcome back to another Capitol View. I'm your host this week, John Patterson, the state government editor for the Daily Herald. It's based in Arlington Heights, but I'm here in Springfield year-round, and we've had an interesting couple days in Springfield to get everyone up to speed on. Joining me this week for a fun discussion of some interesting events is Chase Castle, who's taking time out from his busy schedule in the Daily Herald's bureau to talk about some of the more important issues. Chase, thanks for being on.
Thanks for having me.
And fresh from the campus of the University of Illinois at Springfield, where he teaches tomorrow's minds about the importance of state government, Charlie Wheeler. Charlie, thanks for being on.
My pleasure, as always.
So I mentioned redistricting and playing some politics. The first thing to bring up would be that the Illinois Senate has approved a constitutional amendment that would change redistricting and how the political maps are drawn in Illinois. Chase, I think that you listened to part of it. Can you give me a quick overview of some of the key parameters, and we'll kind of fill in from there?
Sure. Well, it's difficult to say, I think, just maybe how significant these changes really are, but some of the more notable ones that this provision that the Senate Democrats had successfully pushed this week was the idea that we were going to denest the districts. In other words, that they no longer would be required to have two actual state representatives sharing the same geography as their respective state senators, but it seemed like the rest of it was just adding a lot of procedure that ultimately was still putting the control in the hands of lawmakers, although there would be what was called a special master, I believe is the term, that would essentially be like an arbiter to settle disputes if lawmakers couldn't agree, but in the end they still retain control, which has made it pretty contentious and much to the dismay of Republicans in both chambers. And Charlie, you've been around. You first came to Springfield to cover the way that we ended up with the redistricting process we have now.
Convention, that is correct, back in 1970.
So what's wrong with the current system?
To look at it from a political point of view, what's wrong with it is that Republicans are fearful that the Democrats will retain their majorities in the House and the Senate after the fall election, and that they'll have the governor, and they'll be able to draw maps, gerrymandered maps, that will keep Democrats in power for another decade. That's the political problem. The theoretical problem, say from a political science point of view, is that by allowing lawmakers to draw maps, you present them with the irresistible temptation to craft districts to protect themselves. And the top priority in map making has always been to safeguard incumbents, and that's been true whether it's Republicans who draw the map or whether it's Democrats who draw the map. And the good government groups and the people who want more citizen involvement argue that politicians shouldn't be allowed to choose their voters, rather the voters should choose politicians, and the way to do that is get someone else to draw the map who's not a politician, who's not connected with it. Find some eminent geographer from, I don't know, the University of Salzburg or somewhere, and have him come in and craft the map without taking into consideration politics. And there's some who would argue you shouldn't take into consideration ethnicity, you shouldn't take into consideration age. All you should look at is geography and numbers of people.
And you have mentioned that Republican fears of being able to have Democrats dominate the map if it proceeds the way the power is now. The problem that has been in the past, or I guess the perceived problem, is that the current system is set up so that if you can't agree on a map, you go to basically a tiebreaker process where a name is literally drawn out of a hat, and if it's a Democratic name, then the Democrats control the map-making process, and if it's a Republican, the Republicans do.
At the risk of going back into ancient time in the days of the dinosaurs, when I started
like the
covering
1970s?
this stuff, well, the problem began before the 1970s. It began basically in the 60s when the U.S. Supreme Court came out with a set of rulings that in essence said legislative districts have to be equal in population, substantially equal. That had always been part of the Illinois Constitution, and as a matter of fact, in the 1800s, the legislature regularly redrew legislative districts until after the census, I believe it was of 1910, they realized that Chicago had more population than the rest of the state, and if they were to divvy up the legislature based on population, Chicago would control. And the downstate rural interests did not want to see that to happen. So for more than 50 years, the constitutional mandate to redraw districts was ignored. Then in the 60s, U.S. Supreme Court comes out and says people represent, or legislators represent people, not trees, therefore they have to have substantial equal population. And Illinois began to move in that direction, and under the old Constitution, if there was an impasse, the result was everyone got elected at large. And so in 1964, after the legislature failed to redraw districts for the Illinois House, all 177 House seats were chosen at large. So you went in to vote and you got, it was called a bedsheet ballot because it was literally like this. It had 236 names on it, 118 Republicans, 118 Democrats, and you were to choose your 177 most qualified people. To avoid that kind of a difficulty in the future, the delegates to the Constitution tried to come up with some foolproof way to guarantee that we wouldn't go to an impasse. And so they crafted this idea of having a ultimate decision being made by drawing a name from a hat, kind of a Russian roulette. The theory was that no political party was going to risk going that route and losing the draw and being mapped out of existence, but rather would ultimately compromise. And that's what happened in 1971. There was a compromise. The legislature couldn't get the job done. It went to this redistricting commission. The members of the commission compromised on a plan. In 1981, the legislature couldn't get it done. It went to a commission. And from my perspective, my point of view is that it was impossible for the House leaders to reach a compromise because of the cutback amendment championed by Pat Quinn, which reduced the size of the Illinois House by 77 members. And so, I'm sorry, by 59 members. And so no legislative leader could agree to sacrifice that many of his people. Let's say Chase is the Democratic leader, I'm the Republican leader. He's not going to say, okay, I'm willing to write off 30 of my people. I'm not willing to say, I'm going to write off 30 of mine. So they couldn't come to a resolution. They drew the name, Democrats won, gerrymandered a map, and lo and behold, the Republicans were still around a decade later. And they realized that this Russian roulette, in essence, the chamber was not loaded. And so in 1991, we weren't able to reach a compromise. Republicans got to draw the map. 2001, Democrats got to draw the map. And I don't think in the future, I don't think there will be any real inclination for parties to reach a compromise because the perceived value of winning that draw and having unilateral control over the map-making process is greater than the perceived downside of losing that draw.
So, Chase, as you mentioned, the plan that the Senate Democrats sponsored has cleared the Senate. What happens next?
Well, I guess at this point it is naturally going to move to the House for approval, but I guess that is when things become a little bit more challenging from the Democrats' perspective because they don't have the numbers, simply put, that they do in the Senate. It is pretty likely, as you and I discussed at one point this week, that this was very calculatedly introduced in the Senate, knowing that they had the proper majority, the constitutionally required 3/5 to advance that out of that chamber, which, assuming that it went straight along a partisan line, and it did, sure enough, yesterday. So at this point, it is going to move to the House, but because they're going to be one vote short of assuming that all Democrats fall in line and GOP opposes, it's going to have, I guess, a bit more of an uncertain future.
And I would, as Jason and I had theorized, that that's probably not by mistake, that's been set up because it kind of essentially paints the Republicans, who have tried to make redistricting one of their key ethical issues against Democrats in the coming elections, in theory are kind of backing themselves into a corner, and in the House they're going to be left with, I would assume that the vote will come up on the last day that it probably can be voted on in early May in order to make the ballot, and if it all goes as planned, you end up one vote short of putting it to voters because the Republicans oppose it, and then they're left trying to explain to the masses of the state why this plan wasn't good while their mailboxes are being stuffed with campaign flyers accusing Republicans of voting down redistricting reform and being against ethical reform. And I don't think that's probably by mistake.
But it occurs to me that there's a way around that, in that the Republicans could say, yeah, this isn't a very good plan, but on the other hand, it's better than what we have now because we go to a special master instead of having this random drawing. So despite all its flaws, we'll support it and we'll send it out to the people and let them decide. And that avoids them being painted in the picture being hypocrites. You know, you say you want reform, but then you don't vote for what's on the table.
What I find interesting, though, on this question of whether or not Republicans are going to step in the House and rally up to actually support this is exactly how sincere Republican Party leaders really were in the introduction of this initial bill, the Republican-supported House bill to, Senate bill, I believe technically, that would have pushed a GOP redistricting agenda, which, as Charlie had mentioned, I think maybe not the exact same bill, but was much more computer generated, much more, I guess, truly, for lack of a better word, objectively laid out and cut out there as far as selecting those map districts go. So I noticed this had a long laundry list of supporters that had supported that. All the major newspapers in Illinois, it seemed, the Campaign for Political Reform headed by Cindy Canary, as well as her associate, I suppose, former prosecutor Patrick Collins, I believe, from the Illinois Reform Commission that Quinn himself had put together last year. And I guess that with that kind of support, it seemed like that would have been something the lawmakers really could have jumped behind, but I also can't help but wonder, at the risk of sounding a little naive maybe, as to how genuine that kind of bill what actually was in the first place.
And that's where I think you get into it, as just mentioned, the Republicans had a plan where it took it out of lawmakers' hands mostly, and the legislative leaders would have appointed a commission, and then that would have been equal number of Republicans and Democrats. Then they were supposed to get together and pick the 9th member who would you essentially move the tiebreaker to the start of the process rather than at the end. And then they draw 2 maps, or they draw a map, they give it to the General Assembly, which has to pass it with 2/3, which would be a really super duper majority. If they can't, it goes back to the commission, they draw a second map. If it can't be passed, then the commission gets to pick which map they want. What I could see, that would be a near impossibility to come up with that 9th member, which would then kick the process to the Illinois Supreme Court. Or the kind of thinking this is Illinois and something will always go wrong. I was asking one of the Republican supporters of it, what if one of your members ends up being a David Souter type, someone that you think is on your team, but it turns out is far more, because the members of the commission are supposed to be like, my other joke would be that the people that you would have to pick from would be Blagojevich jurors, because you're going to have to find people with no political ties whatsoever to meet the qualifications, and the only people you're going to be able to find would be the Blagojevich jury. But if having no voting record or service in the General Assembly, you pick somebody and it turns out that they're more loyal to the other side's thoughts once this process plays out, they approve a crazy partisan map, it can't get approved because of the super duper majority. Well, eventually this now partisan panel that you don't like anymore gets to pick which map it wants, and lawmakers have no say. And I could very easily see the supporters of this suddenly clamoring that this is a terrible process and we've got to overhaul it now, which is usually the way things work out in Illinois. But it'll be interesting to see, because I assume that the Republicans will get backed into the deadline for having to decide, like Charlie said, is this better than what we've got now, and how do they've also kind of backed themselves into the corner because they've rallied all of the editorial boards to support their map, not this plan, and if now they suddenly flip, they've got to explain themselves to all of their previous supporters of why suddenly they thought this was good.
Well, I would put in a word of caution. As somebody who was a working stiff, a reporter for 24 years, I learned early on that editorial boards don't always understand what it is they pontificate about.
I'm shocked and appalled.
Yeah, and I'm sure you share that opinion.
Charlie's opinions are merely his own and do not reflect all members of CapitolView.
Particularly those who are still working for newspapers, right?
So moving on from the politics of redistricting, as I mentioned in the promotion here, the governor on what was a kind of an odd little event, but it was nice. Had a visitor from outer space this week, and I'm not talking about the giant meteor that's on everyone's websites. Kind of out of the blue, so to speak, we had an event in the governor's office to honor Robert Satcher, in which this past week there was a Robert Satcher Day. Who is an incredibly brilliant man, for lack of a better term, who has medical degrees and engineering degrees from MIT, and his medical degree is raised from Northwestern, and then he went on to become an astronaut and has walked in space twice. And he's from Virginia originally, but his degree is from Northwestern, and that's apparently his Illinois tie. And the governor decided to invite him to Illinois, and had a nice event, named a day after him. And in return, Governor Pat Quinn now has a flag, an Illinois flag, that has actually been in outer space.
Well, I think there are people who would argue that kind of the Illinois leadership has been in outer space or on some other planet for the last several years. So maybe this was an apropos to have a visit from a real, honest-to-goodness astronaut.
I was hoping you'd pick up on my softball there. Moving on from Saturday, I just wanted to note that. Speaking of kind of policies that are a bit out there and everyone kind of scratches their head about, in a matter of hours, news broke at the Capitol that Quinn was appointing a longtime aide, pal, to a new post at the Department of Natural Resources, which has been strapped for cash for many, many years, and at times has had numerous state parks closed down. And his aide was going to be, it was dubbed the Canoe Czar. He was going to be in charge of canoe and kayaking waterways and finding new ways to get them used in the state, and he was going to be paid $85,000 a year. The story went out on the Lee Enterprises news outlet. I think it was written by Kurt Erickson, and within a matter of hours, the governor quickly rescinded the Canoe Czar position, and under some criticism from lawmakers, because the Department of Natural Resources that day was presenting its budget requests and other information to lawmakers who, needless to say, were kind of wondering where the 85 grand was coming from for a Canoe Czar. Care to weigh in, Charlie, on?
Well, to me, it was, that's the kind of thing that I would say reflects this being out of touch with reality idea. I'm not somebody who's a canoer. I'm not somebody who's a kayaker. I'm pretty much of a couch potato when it comes down to it. I watch that stuff on ESPN. I have a lot of respect for the people who do it. And I'm sure that there is a very fervent contingent of Illinoisans for whom this is very important, having waterways where they can exercise their sport. But on the other hand, if you look at just the political reaction to this kind of thing, the state is in a position where we can't pay school teachers, where we're cutting early childhood programs, where we have prison overcrowding, where we have legislators who are going to be evicted from their offices because the state's not paying rent. I know there won't be a lot of sympathy for that group, but there are a lot of very pressing needs, and I think the average guy would scratch his head and say, why do we need 85 grand for a Canoe Czar when my kid's school is laying off teachers, and if my kid wants to play sports next year, I'm going to have to fork over $150. And so the timing was just really bizarre. It was like somebody's not paying attention to what's going on. It was like the idea a few months ago that we're going to give up this free space that we have, and we're going to go and rent space for the Department on Aging so that everybody can be underneath the same roof. Or it was like that golden parachute for a former staffer at the Department of Human Services who was going to be appointed to a cush job over in South Africa at megabucks. There's decisions that are being made, and it appears to me that there's no rational, sane adult overseeing these decisions before they're thrown out there. Somebody who has kind of a sense of what's going on in the state and what the public is thinking, the attitude that average citizens have towards the government. And this stuff just fuels the notion that the people in charge are idiots.
And I think what's even more fascinating, honestly, than the sort of strange idea in the first place that we were going to have somebody whose job was dedicated towards something as specific as recreational kayaking was how quickly Governor Quinn seemed to rescind the idea. I mean, I can appreciate, as a reporter in the modern age, you might say, that news travels quickly and things have a tendency to become more viral and reach the original sources more quickly than they ever do. But on the other hand, it seems that one of the things that Governor Quinn gets the most serious criticism from in the press whenever it comes time to sort of, pontificate on an editorial board or wherever the source, is the sort of general feeling that Governor Quinn lacks real leadership ability, that he's not assertive, that he doesn't stick by his guns, and that he doesn't necessarily have a set, agenda, and perhaps even that he really, aside from this, percentage point tax increase, that he really feels strongly about. And it seems, again, that for him to, on one hand, introduce this idea, say it's fantastic for recreation, for health, for probably even tourism development, this is likely couched under, but then within a matter of hours to suddenly go back and say, throwing your hands in the air, excuse me, I guess it wasn't such a hot idea, kind of underscores this bigger picture concern I think there is that Governor Quinn just might not actually have really serious leadership skills.
But on the other hand, he's learning, because it took him a week to kill that Department on Aging lease. So maybe they'll get to the point where somebody stops this stuff before it gets out in the public.
Next up will be the news conference in which he announces something and then denounces it in the same news conference. The governor is doing some things that we kind of wondered when it was going to happen, and there had been some speculation of whether there was an agenda at hand, but the governor did sign the pension reforms that the General Assembly had crammed through in one day over the fervent opposition of public sector employee unions in the state. The governor had taken, well, I guess after lawmakers had done it in a matter of 10 or 12 hours, it seemed like his own sweet time in deciding to sign it, and there were those who were wondering if there was something up with this. But the governor signed it, and kind of the news out of it was that, lo and behold, they believe the savings from these changes, which generally will require people to work longer in their jobs to collect smaller pensions than today's workforce, is that over the next 35 or 40 years, these changes will save upwards of $200 billion. It had been originally touted as $100-some billion in savings. Though I will say, from having covered the initial hearings, when lawmakers would ask how much this is going to save and have we actually ran the numbers, the response was, no, we haven't run the numbers, but we think it will save at least this much. So the $200 billion in savings might actually be a real number. It's just kind of hard to fathom. That takes effect for all new employees with the state, teachers, local governments, university employees who would be hired after January 1. It would raise the retirement age to 67 in order to begin collecting a pension, and changes some of the parameters on what a maximum pension can be based on and what the final average will be based on as well. As I said, ultimately the goal will be the goal is pensions that are less lucrative, so to speak, than today's workforce, and that's how you get the savings over years. It's been a long time coming. It still doesn't really do anything to address the nearly $80 billion kind of backlog liability that the state is still struggling to pay off for not fully funding pensions over the last several decades. What did I leave out, Charlie?
That pretty much covers it. And it does apply not just to state employees, because people like to rail about state employees and how they're all lazy and they shouldn't have any pension at all. It covers every public worker in Illinois except for police and fire.
And that's supposedly coming.
And that is supposedly coming, yeah. And the basic idea is that we will, in the future, make people work longer and we'll give them less when they retire. And that will save us a lot of money in the long haul.
We should also point...
And the numbers are, they're all based on estimates, because what you're doing, the actuaries sit down and they figure out, well, how many workers are there going to be? At what age will they ultimately retire? How long will they live after that? How much money will we need to pay their benefits, and how sizable will the benefits be at that time? So they do all of these calculations, and then they do the estimate. What's likely to be there? How much money will the state, as the employer, be putting aside to pay for these benefits over time? How much will the state workers or the public workers be putting in from their monthly or weekly paycheck to cover these benefits over time? How much will all these investments earn? So it's a lot of educated guesswork, I guess would be the word for it. And the reason why we have this near $80 billion difference between what we're obligated to pay and what's likely to be there is because for years, for decades, the state as the employer did not put in its required share. I would venture to say there's never been a school teacher, there's never been a state worker, there's never been a university employee, I know in my case this is true, who has not had that pension contribution taken out of the paycheck every pay period. It's the state that has not set the money aside, which is why we're in such a huge hole.
I think there might have been one exception, and that would have been, I think, that the state employees the state may have picked up the state employees' share
Right.
1 or 2 years, but that was in exchange for them giving up a raise.
A pay raise,
Yeah.
right. And so that contribution was made, although it was made
It's
by
kind of like
the
an
state.
opportunity cost instead
Right.
of just a direct
Yeah,
cost.
that was part of the collective bargaining agreement.
And in that news conference, there's been no shortage of the unions in Illinois do wield a great deal of political force, and there have been lawmakers who have been suggesting, we don't want 67-year-old police and firefighters, we don't want 67-year-old kindergarten teachers. Let's start rolling these back. And at the news conference, the governor did say he's not interested in doing that, and the legislative leaders also said that. That said, this only does apply to people hired after January 1, so we've got 30 or 40 years of aspiring politicians to come up with the next early retirement plan to gain favor with the unions before this will really come into play.
Well, I thought Senate President Cullerton had a great line when people were talking about how 67 is too old. And he pointed out that the Speaker of the House, Mike Madigan, is in fact 67, or he is soon to be 67. I think his birthday is in April, I don't know what day. And he said he seems to be still going strong.
And with that, we're out of time. Before we go, I would like to thank Amanda Vinicky, who filled in as a guest host last year and provided some much-needed energy to the program. So thank you, Amanda, if you're watching. And I'd like to thank Chase Castle and Charlie Wheeler for being here this week, and to remind everyone that you can catch this and other Network Knowledge programs now on YouTube on the Network Knowledge channel. So look us up and check us out, and we'll be back next week with another Capitol View. Thanks for watching.